Hey guys, and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It's your boy Tim here, and we'll be taking a look today, as you can probably tell from what's in my hands, some more smartphones. And on the agenda today, the best budget devices. So I've been recommending Motorola Moto G phones for a number of years now, and this year they've come out with the Moto G5 line. So in this hand, I've got the Motorola Moto G5 Plus, and over here the Moto G5. So the Plus variant is slightly more expensive, comes with a few extra features, but both phones still sit in the US $200 to $250 market, making them really affordable options for those who don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on the top tier devices like the Galaxy S8. Motorola has made a number of improvements to the Moto G line with the G5, and one of the key upgrades is the design. In past devices, we've gotten a pretty cheap and crappy feeling plastic construction, but with the Moto G5 and G5 Plus, Motorola has introduced metal for the first time, not just in the Premium Plus model, but also in the more affordable G5. So we're getting a much nicer design across the board. It feels a lot better in your hands, though it's still not a premium chassis. It's still got a bit of plastic around the edges, where some Chinese OEMs are going with a more metal unibody feel, and the bezels on the front of both devices are still very large. So Motorola is still positioning this device towards more of the budget end of the spectrum, but I still appreciate the upgrades that they've made here to introduce things like metal and a more premium feel. The Moto G5 Plus is the slimmer of the two devices, and it's also slightly larger with a 5.2-inch display on the front. The Moto G5 has a 5-inch display on the front, same 1080p resolution, but it is also thicker at more like 10 millimeters thick as opposed to 7.7 millimeters in the Moto G5 Plus. And the reason for this is to accommodate the removable battery. This is the only of the two Moto G5 devices that comes with a removable battery, and what this means is that the phone needs to be thicker to accommodate some of the extra housing for that removable battery assembly. Taking off the back of this phone is pretty tough, I will have to say that, but underneath the hood you get that 2800 mAh battery, two SIM card slots, I should say, nano SIMs here, and also that micro SD card slot. On the Moto G5 Plus, both of those features are included in a tray that you'll find on the top edge. Motorola hasn't introduced USB Type-C to the G line just yet, so we're still getting micro USB on the bottom of both devices here. That does make it a bit cheaper to purchase accessories and cables, but you know, it's a USB Type-C revolution at the moment, and I hope that a future iteration of these devices includes that feature. And Motorola isn't a dumb smartphone company. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack on the top. It's pretty much exactly what you want to see here. Another good thing about the Moto G5 in particular is that this is the first G series phone that includes a fingerprint sensor on the front. Last year's model, the G4, just the Plus model had a fingerprint sensor, but they've added that to the cheaper model this time around, and it's got a much nicer look and feel to it as well, makes it a bit easier to operate, and of course, fingerprint sensor is still included on the G5 Plus if you wanted to spend a bit more money. Another similarity between both devices is the speaker setup. Just the single speaker here included above the display for both your in-car audio and also your loudspeaker. It does go pretty loud, which can come in handy for when you're on a phone call, but the quality isn't great. No stereo audio experiences here, and to be honest, you can't really expect much more from such an affordable handset. Both of these budget handsets pack 1080p IPS LCDs, 5.2 inches in the G5 Plus and 5 inches in the G5. What surprised me here is that the display in the G5 is actually superior to the display in the G5 Plus. Not only is it brighter, 570 nits in the G5 compared to 500 nits in the G5 Plus, it also has a better contrast ratio and better color accuracy out of the box. Both of these phones are configured to use the vibrant display mode out of the box, and on the G5 Plus, it's surprisingly inaccurate relative to the G5. The G5 is much closer to the ideal color temperature accuracy, as you can see here in some of our SpectraCal charts, and also it pulls away in grayscale, color checker, and saturation accuracy, whereas on the G5 Plus, none of these features are particularly accurate. In fact, the G5, compared to some of the other phones on the market, has a pretty decent display in terms of its color accuracy. Also, another interesting thing about these phones is that on the G5, if you switch from the vibrant to the standard display mode, you will get a more accurate display on this particular device, but switching over to the G5 Plus, making that same change actually makes the display worse. So It's a bit interesting that on the more affordable of the two handsets, they've included a better display. It's only a marginal improvement, I will have to say. Both phones have very decent displays for a budget handset, but I would like to see, for those that purchase and spend a bit more money on the G5 Plus, that they do get a slightly superior display experience. Let's take a look at the hardware in these devices now, starting with the cheaper of the two, the Moto G5. Now, in last year's model, the Moto G4, we saw a Qualcomm Snapdragon 617 SoC clocked at up to 1.5 GHz across 8 CPU cores. However, in the Moto G5, we're seeing a Snapdragon 430 SoC, so a downgrade in SoC tier, but it's a pretty similar configuration here. We're still getting 8 ARM Cortex A53 CPU cores. They're now clocked at 1.4 GHz, so a slight downgrade here, and we're seeing an Adreno 505 GPU, so again, a very minor downgrade. And in my opinion, Motorola has basically done a sideways move here, moving from the 617 to the 430, and that leads to very similar CPU performance, as we'll take a look at in a moment. There are two configurations of the Moto G5. One comes with 16 GB of internal storage and 2 GB of RAM, and a slight upgrade with 32 GB of storage and 3 GB of RAM. You get LTE Category 4, Wi-Fi 802.11 A, B, G, and N, so no AC included in this device, and Bluetooth 4.2, no NFC either in the cheaper of the two phones. Looking at the Moto G5 Plus, this device comes with an upgraded SoC compared to last year's model. The G4 Plus again used the Snapdragon 617, but in the Moto G5 Plus, we're seeing a Qualcomm Snapdragon 625 SoC. And again, this is the same octa-core ARM Cortex A53 CPU design, so Motorola loves that octa-core design, but it's now clocked at 2.0 GHz on the G5 Plus, so a pretty significant clock speed improvement. We're also seeing an Adreno 506 GPU, and that does provide a fairly decent bump in GPU performance compared to last year's model. There are a range of G5 Plus configuration options available. You can choose between 32 and 64 gig of internal storage. There's also either 2, 3, or 4 GB of RAM. The configurations there depend highly on your region, the storage, whatever, so definitely check what's available for you. My review unit was 32 gig and 4 GB of RAM, so a pretty decent configuration there. And it's great to see that you get 32 gig in the entry-level model for a phone that only costs $230. Pretty decent. You'll also get NFC in some regions. Definitely check what's available for you again. LTE Category 6, a slight upgrade from the G5, but you still only are limited to Wi-Fi A, B, G, and N, so no AC, and Bluetooth 4.2 as well. For those of you interested in smartphone benchmarks, we will be breezing through a number of them for you here today. Of course, it's Hardware Unboxed. What would we be doing if we didn't show some benchmarks? Let's get straight into it. And taking a look at the Moto G5 Plus relative to the G5, we are seeing that 43% higher clock speed on the G5 Plus, and this translates into 37% more performance in CPU limited workloads on average. So that does lead to a more snappy experience in general. Compared to last year's model, the G5 Plus is 38% faster on average than the G4 Plus, and compared to some devices with the older Snapdragon 410 SoC, like the Moto G3, the Snapdragon 625 provides 71% more performance. So if you're using a 2-year-old budget device with the Snapdragon 410 or 400 inside, you see a pretty significant performance improvement moving to the G5 Plus. For those more interested in the G5, as I mentioned earlier, it's more of a sideways move here. It's 1% slower than the Moto G4 in our CPU workload, so that's within the margin of error. And compared to the Snapdragon 410, again, if you're moving from an older budget device, 24% more performance in the G5. So decent enough upgrade there. Moving to our GPU benchmarks here, and the Moto G5 Plus is 42% faster than the Moto G5 here, thanks to that faster Adreno 506 GPU. It also holds a decent 46% lead on the Moto G4 Plus, which was another 1080p handset, while it obliterates older Snapdragon 410 SoCs. That SoC is more designed for 720p display, so not a big surprise here. Moto G5 buyers shouldn't despair, because the Snapdragon 430 SoC is a capable SoC for 1080p displays, unlike some of the older 400 series chips. The G5 is more than 3 times as fast as Snapdragon 410 handsets. However, it loses to the Moto G4 last year's model by approximately 6% on average. Not a big deal here, and both of these handsets are still capable of playing today's popular smartphone games. In terms of NAND performance, this is another area where it was surprising to see the Moto G5 have a performance edge on the G5 Plus. The 16 gigabytes of NAND in my review unit was around 28% faster than the G5 Plus's 32 gigabytes of NAND, though both phones perform pretty well in this regard for an entry-level handset. In terms of battery life, the Moto G5 has a 2800 mAh removable battery. The G5 Plus, it's a bit slimmer but packs a 3000 mAh non-removable battery, so it's 7% larger than the G5. It also uses a more efficient manufacturing node for the SoC inside, 14 nanometers for the G5 Plus, 28 nanometers on the G5, and that produces a more efficient SoC that can last a bit longer in our battery tests. As we look here through some of our tests, the G5 Plus is a fantastic performer across the board, producing very solid results for a mid-range phone, and despite the fact that it packs the same battery capacity as last year's G4 Plus, it actually outperforms the G4 Plus by a significant margin thanks to that more efficient SoC. The G5 does fall a bit behind the G5 Plus, although that's not surprising considering it has a smaller battery and a less efficient SoC, though still very solid results for the G5 across our tests here, and it does outperform some of the previous models from Motorola's G series. If you've managed to get through this far into the review, you'll probably notice I've been pretty positive so far, but there is one area from both devices that has unfortunately regressed compared to last year. You might have guessed it, it is the camera, the one area I haven't talked about just yet. Motorola has been talking up the camera in the G5 Plus in particular because they're very proud of how they've included a 12 megapixel sensor with dual pixel technology, the same sensor used in the Samsung Galaxy S7. So you should be expecting pretty good photos from this camera, right? Well, unfortunately, Motorola hasn't put a lot of time and effort into the processing, and that leads to pretty disappointing results here. When you take a look at some photos, things like contrast, dynamic range, color saturation, metering, and so forth all fall behind the Galaxy S7 because the S7 uses superior processing. There are some areas where the G5 Plus is superior to last year's G4 Plus, such as in its low light performance. This camera has larger internal pixels, so you get a brighter experience there, and the focusing times, thanks to its dual pixel phase detection autofocus, is significantly faster than last year's model. But I actually think the G4 Plus delivers better photos across the board, and that's disappointing because this camera does have a better sensor in it. The G5 Plus should produce better photos, but it simply doesn't, and that's a bit disappointing. That said, its detail is one area where it does take the edge over the Galaxy S7. You get pretty decent detail from an entry-level phone here. In terms of the Moto G5, we're seeing another regression, this time compared to the Moto G4 Play, the ultra cheap phone from last year. It's a 13 megapixel sensor in this camera, but again, Motorola hasn't focused too deeply on the camera's processing, and this leads to pretty mediocre results across the board. It is prone a little bit to washing out, and its inside results when you're indoors under artificial lights, and its low light performance is nothing special whatsoever. So again, disappointing because the Moto G4 Play was a very capable camera for such a cheap price, and I wish that Motorola would have spent a bit more time optimizing some of the processing in these two phones. You get a very similar camera app in both the G5 and the G5 Plus, not particularly great, not a whole ton of features there. The Moto G5 Plus is the only phone of the two that supports 4K capture. This is actually a pretty decent feature considering we haven't seen that before in the Moto G line. You're restricted to just 1080p capture in the Moto G5. And in terms of their selfie cameras, both are 5 megapixel units with an f2.2 lens. Decent results here, nothing too amazing. And again, it leads to a pretty average camera experience for both of these entry-level phones. I'm not going to talk too much about the software on these handsets because both run stock Android 7.0 out of the box. If you're familiar with stock Android, you'll love the experience provided here. There are a few minor tweaks here and there, but it's nothing that significantly impacts the experience. When I asked Motorola about the software updates for these handsets, they did say they're planning on producing quarterly upgrades. This is mostly due to carrier and regulator restrictions in some regions. They simply can't push it out faster than that. So a bit disappointed we're not seeing monthly upgrades, and both of these devices only come with the January security upgrades out of the box. It's May now, I'd really like to see a more updated handset here, so we'll have to wait and see what Motorola's track record is in delivering those promised quarterly upgrades. The main selling point for the Moto G5 line is how it brings all this great hardware and features and performance into such an affordable price point. For those of you in the United States, the Moto G5 Plus retails for just $230 US, which is an absolute bargain for what you get in my opinion. It's also $20 cheaper than last year's Moto G4 Plus, and you can save even more money if you're willing to put up with Amazon lock screen ads. For what you get in this phone, even considering that regressed camera compared to the G4 Plus, I still think it's a really solid buy at its price point. Unfortunately, the Moto G5 isn't available in the United States, but you will find it in other regions like Europe for 200 euros or in Australia for just $300 dues. At that price point, you get such a great experience in terms of its performance and battery life. It's really hard to pass up at that price. However, if you are willing to spend a bit more money in Australia, $400 dues for the Moto G5 Plus, you get a bit better performance, a bit better camera, and a bit better battery life. At that price point, it can make it a bit of a compelling option if you have a bit more money to spend, but at $300, really, it's hard to pass up the Moto G5, and Motorola has really hit the nail on the head once again with their budget smartphone offerings for 2017. Anyway, that's it for this review of Motorola's budget handsets. You can check out all the analysis and benchmark graphs, whatever, on techspot.com, so head over there and check that stuff out. Don't forget, we've got links to our Patreon below. Thanks to all the supporters out there who've been supporting us in our Patreon so far, and we'll catch you in the next one.